Hello everyone, today we talk about sound signals in the Roman army during early imperial time, let's say. We will make other videos for previous later ones. This is an incredibly important topic, very overlooked, because the importance of sound signal was crucial for Roman tactics, and not just the Roman ones indeed. And it surely informed a bit also a broader dimension than the one we're used to think, even at a symbolical level and a religious one even. Today's video, actually I wanted to do it on the specific music instrument players in the Roman army, and let's say trying to derive some information from sources about their relevance as specific individuals, specific fighters. But I guess it's more important to address the thing in broader terms, so we'll surely make other videos about other eras, but today we mostly tend to condensate a bit both the sound signaling, the figures of the players, and the same musical instruments all together, which can help even with the specific quotes, specific sources we'll use to get a broader picture. So, as we were saying, sound signal had a fundamental importance in the Roman art of war, because all commands were given, or at least confirmed, by a series of sound signals that were emitted by wind instruments, trumpets and horns, that the soldiers had to be capable to recognize and interpret immediately, at the moment. Right now, today, unfortunately, we do not know, as we often say, how Roman tactics actually, especially small units, really worked. Right, as we always say, everybody who comes to you and say, the Romans fought like that because they listened it on YouTube. There's what manifolds in this way. They had that meters of space. The soldiers were. It's all. It's nonsense. Nobody knows. We have zero evidence. Right, we just have some hints here and there, but there is no way, and this is universally unknown, historiographically speaking, and there is really very few to add. But we can really understand that the immediacy, the importance of the signal orders was surely combined with a dynamic combat that naturally had its, it was, in the case of the Roman army, not radically different from the one of other peoples, right? More or less, they fought in similar ways. It's just that, naturally, the internal organization and training, collective one especially, were importantly regulated by all this, and surely sound signals were important for all armies out there, from the Celts to the Macedonians. I mean, all the range of military development that you can find there, that had always been, right? Not just as a, in the mechanical sense of the order, right, what to do, right, which as moderns we're mostly focused in, and we have as definitely some prejudices about what the world was like then from a modernistic perspective, but we tend to ignore also the moral aspect of this, that is, what these sounds actually meant beyond the relative order, and what the same music actually functioned like in the mindset, let's say, of an ancient Roman. Today also we want to open the topic of different musical cultures in the ancient world, because importantly, the Eastern one was renownedly already more advanced with the drums. Think about the Parthians, how that was a very ancient tradition. We made a video last year about the Islamic military music. It was based on essentially medieval times, but it also it had its roots in this millenary tradition in the Middle East that also the Romans encountered, fighting against those peoples. In the West, let's say, there was less emphasis on such things even during the Middle Ages, but in my opinion, I think we have it underestimated, also historiographically speaking, and we in this earlier world, in ancient times, let's say, many peoples were more similar to let's say a prehistorical reality, right? If you look at the Germans, if you look at peoples that were living in a sense very much more deeply in than already what the Romans were more developed, more secularized if you want, but absolutely not in the way we intend modernly, at least by degree. And had in these instruments literally the voices of the gods speaking, right? And this is something you often don't hear for the Roman army as well, but I formed an impression, it is not better than an hypothesis, that we'll see in a while, because surely also these messages were sacred. I mean, the concept of the imperium as a religious military authority that fundamentally descends from heavens to direct to command the army surely passed also through the music, and we can easily see that from some religious aspects of the same Roman military music, and the same fact that the principals that were the same music players on the field were provided with some symbology that speaks for the same, the bear skin, all this, idea of a possession from the side of the gods that the Romans had identical basically to any other people at the time. It's not just like a Nordic thing, or it was present everywhere since millennia all over the Mediterranean, pretty much everywhere in the world. I'm telling the truth, and I think we have tended to let's say, to not to even take that into adequate consideration, which instead is something that I'm reevaluating personally very much, not just for my interest for a history of religions, but in general because I see the same pattern everywhere, and it's so simple, it's almost embarrassing, and yet I know very few, I never heard actually anybody talking about this, really, right, about surely the importance of religions, of sounds, the idea, I don't know, that the Carnix, for example, was to emit sounds of a certain animal within a certain reality, a certain environment connected to the religiosity, of course. But as far as the Romans are concerned, I literally never heard of it. Never, nor at university, nor in books, nor anywhere. So I think that is worth being reevaluated. I'm not sure somebody wrote about it because it's so evident in some sense. But coming back to the practicality, of course, sound signals were for the army in combat. There's an hint that tells you much about this. That is the fact that the incapacity of distinctly hearing sounds was not admitted, not just in the act of recruitment when the volunteers joined the Roman army, but also if it intervened during the service, and it was a reason of immediate and forced discharge with honor, because it was the honesta missio, but ex causa, and the causa here was the fact of the fact that the soldier couldn't hear the orders and therefore was a danger for all others, and that tells you naturally because if it had been a problem just for himself, right? It's not that the Romans cared much about a person more, a person less, and not that everybody would have hearing problems, but at a collective level, if somebody goes astray from what others do, can endanger the whole freaking unit, and that's something you cannot afford by any standard. And that tells you how important these sounds really were for Roman tactics. And besides their prevalent tactical function, the sound effects had certainly, as we were saying before, a remarkable psychological effect, as Caesar in the De Bello Gallico 392 states, because he says, quote, it's not without motive that with the purpose of depressing the enemy and to animate your own troops, that the trumpets sound from any side and that the soldiers shout. This is important also because we get this prejudice that the Roman soldier would ever stay silent, whatever. Really not. War cries existed in the Roman army throughout all the time, and if anything, you'd see silence in approaching to the enemy, and then a shout at the moment of the attack, which naturally made the psychological effect of the impact. This was used also by other peoples, but surely this contrast between the more disciplined silent and eventually force unleashed was very effective, and never underestimate in that sense the individuality also of Roman combat. It was stressed dramatically because being disciplined and collectively trained doesn't necessarily mean you you're useless also if you're not really in formation, or at least if you fight as with that reminiscence of warriorhood, let's say, that survived definitely in the Roman soldier. Doesn't matter how hardly it had been disciplined. Now, we know that Scipio Africanus, I mean, not yet, because he was to win that day, but, we remind him with that cognomen, made use of trumpets and horns at the Battle of Zama in order to scare and throw into, disarray the elephants of Hannibal. This is what Livy at least says, 33. While in numerous other cases, a sudden and noisy use of all the trumpets produced the effect to paralyze the enemy by preventing or retarding his reaction. This is what Sallustio says, for example, in the Jugurthine War 99. The trumpets were used also to trick the enemy on the consistency of your own forces and their positioning. This is what Frontinus, the Stratagemata 4.3 says, or simply to disturb him in order to prevent him to rest the night before the decisive battle. Still, the Stratagemata 12.1 and Ammianus, 19.2.5. Naturally, as far as early imperial times are concerned, we have to use sources from other times as well, but for the Roman history in general, because it's not that there is an enormous amount of information, and comparisons are useful, but also have to be very by analogy, but must be also very carefully carried out. So today we know 4 musical instruments that were used by the Romans in the military: the tuba, the cornu, the bucina, and the Lituus. The latter is usually ignored, but the players of these instruments were framed in the organic of the legion, were known as aineatores, from ais, that is bronze, right? The material with which these instruments were prevalently made. And the existence of figures of aineatores, immunes specifically, makes us believe that, in general, these troops were not these men were not exempted from labor force, just like the other legionnaires. In other words, they participated fully to military life. They were legionnaires themselves. There is, however, instead no a type of evidence in the military use of tambours, of drums, that were known as tympani, that were employed only in civilian music, in spectacle, and the drums were instead used in war almost exclusively, as we were saying before, by Eastern peoples, in particular by the Parthians. Plutarch, for example, describes the psychological effect famously at the Battle of Carrhae, right? We would also have to explain why that was the case. It has to do with, even in here, with practical and also cultural reasons. In any case, it's from those regions that drums made their appearance in the West, but only in medieval times. Also, we do not know anything about sound signals that would be eventually reproduced in march, during the march, and in combat. It is like we have some kind of songs. We can sometimes giving the quantities and all this stuff, kind of think what the rhythm could be, but they're kind of isolated in not of dramatic use. But we can't just make some dare some suppositions. We can't presume, for example, given the emphasis and the frequency with which, even marginally though, the various authors touched on the topic, that such signals were rather numerous, and that the soldiers had to know them perfectly in order to maneuver in an effective way. It was perhaps a sort of binary code, right? The only was capable of transmitting a multiplicity of commands starting from simple fundamental signals. And the fundamental signals had to be modulated on the base of the duration. For example, the quantity, a long or short signal, while it seems to be way more difficult that they could be modulated on the tone, given the extreme simplicity of the instruments that were capable of emitting just a few notes. The signal of the attack had to be very similar to the modern charge, according to Cassius Dio 5622. The survivors of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, encircled by the Germans, managed to get away, making the trumpeters playing, quote, a fast rhythm motive that would simulate the imminent arrival of reinforcements, which is fascinating because you can almost feel this, like this dun, 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 like something like that would make even the Germans know that would something was about to happen, right? Because these sounds were not like in code, but they they transmitted this sense, this feeling that had to strike for its immediate realization. So such a fast sound would naturally reflect the imminence of some change, some new occurrence. So speaking of the individual instruments, we start with the tuba, the trumpet, basically. That was used by the Romans. It had almost certainly Etruscan origins, like many Roman musical instruments. We get it, for example, from Virgil's Aeneid 8, 526. It was clearly inspired to the salpings. There was this long trumpet used in Greece and even mentioned in the Iliad, so very, very, very old, and used therefore by many peoples before as a general, as a primordial almost instrument. And it was constituted by a thin copper bronze tube, roughly 4 feet long, that is basically 120 centimeters, perhaps composed by 2 or more pieces, and with a funnel-shaped terminal opening and a removable reed. And the sound of the tuba had to be very grave and intense, so much to be that it could be heard clearly at great distances and to be heard over the clangor of the battle. And the tuba didn't, however, have the power and therefore also the acoustic capacity of the modern valve trumpets, and therefore they had to require, in order for the sound to reach great distances, a frequent repetition of the signal, and therefore a discrete number of players interspersed among the troops. For example, at Gergovia, in spite Caesar had given the signal of retreat, the legionnaires did not listen to the trumpet sound because they were separated from a rather extended depression. This is from the Bello Gallico 747. Virgil in the Aeneid 9, 503 and Livy 38, 5 define the sound of the tuba as terrible, right? While Ennius describes onomatopoeically the sound with the word tara tantara. And according to Vegetius 222, the tuba was used especially to give the signal of the advance towards the enemy and the one of retreat. So the most important, if you want, and it could reach all the arm, because that is the important. I mean, these instruments were calibrated also for the degree of units that had to encompass, extensionally speaking. So this is true in any epoch, right? Usually, I don't know, in the Middle Ages were this huge timpani that would sound like boom boom, and giving this cadenced pace that would also help in the broader maneuvers of the whole army, right? Instead, at a smaller units level, there were less powerful instruments, but maybe more relatively more sophisticated to give this some useful signals for a more fast-paced interaction during combat and so on. Caesar, surprised by the Nervi, famously Battle of Sabis River in the Bello Gallico 220, hadn't had signum tuba dare, right? That is, to give with the trumpet the signal to move against the enemy. So it's a big deal for the entire army, right? Because we're talking about large maneuvers. So this was actually, also how the battle went. Eventually the day was saved by reinforcements, etc. So for the deployment, this was a big deal. And even Vercingetorix at Alesia, in order to attempt a sudden sortie, dat tuba signum, so gives the sign of the trumpet, but at least in his case, as a goal, using the carnix, that is the characteristic Celtic vertical trumpet. And differently from the horn that played only for the ensign bearers, the tuba addressed all the soldiers, as we have seen before, and therefore it was used for, let's say, signaling of general interest. It is, the three signals described by Flavius Josephus, the Judaic War 354, are all emitted by tuba, right? These were communicating the order of the disassembling of the tentage, the loading of the material on carts and mules, and the and leaving the leave of the camp. So as we were saying before, the tuba signalized mostly the broader movements, and if in the camp were present two consuls, or however two commanders of equal rank, the tuba signals had to be given twice. We know this from Caesar from the Civil War 382. And knowing this custom, Hasdrubal suspected the presence of the second consul, Claudius Nero, in the Roman camp in Metaurus River. We know this from Livy 2746. And there are no certain elements to establish whether the number and the framing of the tuba player was the tubican, plural tubicines, in the internal organization of the Roman legion. Some hypothesize the presence of a tubican within each maniple, but almost certainly every cohort was provided at least with one. Sallustius the Jugurthan War 99 says that. Besides a tubican princeps that was assigned to the commander-in-chief, and that had probably the task to give the first signal. And the existence of a tubican princeps also leaves us, imagining the existence of an internal hierarchy in the group of the players. They were generally reunited, such other specialists, in a collegium proper, that is a professional corporation, which naturally had its own religious value. I wouldn't be surprised that since the signia were the ensigns were sacred, right? That even if not the musical instruments proper, but surely the musical aspect of the wall, let's say, was had its own sacred character, as we were saying before, and this hierarchy of players reveals also a properly fighting nature of the same individuals, meaning that not only their task was sacred in this, given it was one of the most important in the army, to make it literally to make it work, but also they were, as we've seen, legionnaires themselves proper. They would have a career, also an internal competition. We can imagine they had a specific task. They were provided with a sacred value, right? At least in the capacity of of mediums, we could say, of the Imperium, right? That had to come in that sense, not just through the commanders, but descend from, as we've seen, from the heavens, and passing also through this animal symbolism that we find, in fact, in the representation. I mean, if you look at the Antonine column, you see there the bear skin for these troops. We see interesting things like, for example, that they are wearing the chainmail, not the segmented armor, probably, but this is not said. I mean, they could wear it anyway for breathing better, given the effort that surely from chest work it had to make, and that is pretty fascinating. Speaking of this, the other instrument, the Cornu, right? This had Etruscan origins too, and it consisted in a long cylindrical or slightly conical tube, either in copper or bronze, bent in a G form, and strengthened by a reinforcement bar in wood to allow the player to transport it on its shoulder. An exemplar found in Pompeii had a complexive length of 320 centimeters, big thing, a diameter of 140, and it was provided with a removable 15 centimeters mouthpiece. The Cornu sounds was defined as raucous by Lucanus in the Pharsalia 133. It was modulated by simply varying the quantity of insufflated air and the position of the lips. And horn player, cornu player, so the cornican, plural cornicines, was present at least in every maniple, if not in every century, and as precised by Vegetius, played exclusively for the ensign bearers. So the purpose was the one to call the attention the soldiers on their own ensign, that indicated with specific movements the operations that every unit had to carry out. It could be advance, stopping, turning left or right, and so on. So you understand why it's important, because it would basically be a poker. Like, you tell you, look at the ensigns, because those are doing stuff, right? So naturally you can't look at the ensign all the time while you're fighting. The ensigns are also usually, not, I mean, they can be on the fore sometimes, but they are also certain soldiers more exposed to go outwards, and the ensign is protected in the middle, so you wouldn't watch them, right? The ensign is fundamental because at some point you have to revert to it. So in the case of battle, that can be a problem, first of all. But so it's vital for you to to always stand by the ensign and to watch carefully what is going on, because the unit can move as well. So the Cornu in this sense was used to say, okay, look at the ensign, what the next order is, right? And while the Cornu sound perhaps is difficult to hear, even though, as we've seen, it was closer to the troops compared to the tuba, because it was more interspersed, there were more players. Still, let's say it should be relatively easier, in spite of the dust and the broader mess, to see eventually what the order is by looking at the ensign, right? That is signaling it specifically. As a consequence, also, the Cornican had thus to find necessarily close to the centurion of his own unit in order to promptly translate into sounds his commands. And when the commands for the individuals and for the units also matched, overlapped, such as in the case of the general sense of sense of general dance or retreat, the tubai and the corna were sounded together. There are beautiful pictures, like, I don't know, here I inserted like cornicinus represented on the 42nd method of the Trofeum Traiani at Amclisi in Romania. You find this and you see they're also the military character. I mean, how they were equipped with a gladius, with they were fully combat personnel, right? It's just the ensign bearers. They had to defend the ensign with their lives. So the fact they weren't equipped with, of course, these would preferably troops that wouldn't be, depending on the situation. I mean, they would be protected mostly. So the fact that they were less defended, like for example, they didn't have a shield, if not a smaller one. In case of the ensign bearers, you usually see the round one. These guys, the musicians, do not seem to own a shield. I think in any representation, at least while using their instruments. In the case of the cornu, is more evident because it was also larger to be held with both hands. Even the tuba, but for the rest, they're kept exactly in the same way. So yes, they were actually fighting force, and were maybe not optimized for such task, but compared to an average legionnaire, but still they were meant to do it, and they would do it because that was the broader mindset, right? There's no difference. What happens on the field requires you to be like that anyway. The other instrument is the bucina. The bucina is often confused with the cornu, actually. It's an ancient wind instrument, essentially carved out of ox horn and from a seashell of conical and spiral, lengthened spiral form that is today still called the tofa. Propertius 4.1.13 describes the bucina as the instrument that once upon a time mastered the ancient Latin shepherds for the assemblies for war, right? And the sound of the bucina was more acute and penetrating than one of the tuba, and according to Varro 6.7, was similar to human singing, and played by the bucinator. It was used to signal the change of the watch duties during the night, so the vigiliae, as recalled by Livy 7.35, by Tacitus Annales 15.30, and by Propertius 4.4.63, and by Polybius even 6.36. The latter of them uses naturally the Greek term bucane, right? That perhaps, if you understand here bucane, perhaps finds this parallelism with the Sanskrit bukhara, which stands for roar. So in the Indo-European languages, you do find this probable etymology. Frontinus, in his Stratagemata 1.5.17, remembers the shrewdness of Sulla that left camp one night, broke camp one night in front of the enemy, and moved silently away with all the army, after, however, having left a bucina player, a bucinator, to simulate the presence of the same army all the night, right, by making him playing regularly all the signals of the watch duty terms. And with the bucina, besides that, with the cardinal, was played also the so-called classicum, that was a signal thus called for its ceremonial and revocative meaning of ancient usages. This is what Seneca in the Controversiae 9.13 says, Tacitus in the Annales 2.32, and Vegetius 3.5 specifically precises that the classicum was played in the presence of the emperor or in occasion of a capital execution that was happening for application of the imperial laws. So this would be essentially the voice of the imperium itself, as we were saying before. Hyginus defines the classicum actually with that camp with a length that is such that from the Decumana gate it's not possible to listen the sound of the Bucina played in front of the Praetorium. So the classicum basically would have had to, was used as we were saying there, even as a unit of measure spatially, right, for the range that it could reach. And as we've seen, these military instruments were designed for that, right? The commanders had to know, right, at which distance these instruments were effective for signaling. So much that in that case, for the camp, Roman camp being famously very well organized, and with all this timing, also the various units that would build it or break it and so on, and move within even during attacks, etc., makes an important difference. And the figure of the Bucinator, differently from the Tubican and the Cornican, doesn't appear to be organically framed in structure of a legion. And however, it's not excluded from the fact that it could overlap with the same one with the Tubican or of the Cornican, that could may have used both the instruments. And on the Bucina and musical instruments in general, the authors, both the older and modern ones, are often imprecise, in particular confusing the Bucina with the Cornu, as the same Vegetsus does, in fact. And the confusion is also due to the fact that the name of Bucina is attributed also to a metallic wind instrument of medieval time. But there are also other contradictions and mismatchings in Polybius 14.3, when he precises that, quote, it's a custom of the Romans that the horn and trumpet players give all together the signal next to the consul's tent when the night watches have to occupy their own places. So we don't actually know there might have been also multiplicity of different instruments of sizes, right? But we don't know exactly, so it's pretty vague. But this information also is to be coupled with what is written in the 6th book, when Polybius states that the signal of the turn change, the change of the watch, was often given basically by the first maniple of the Triarii, which didn't station next to the consul's stand. Now, there is this other overlooked instrument, that is the Lituus, right, that also had a probable Etruscan origin, that consists in a shorter tuba with a slightly conical face, and with the funnel shaped extremity bent in a J form, in a more or less pronounced way, and that due its name to this similarity with the homonymous characteristic sacerdotal baton, was used by the augures to drive the auspices. Macrobius says this from the Saturnalia 6.8, and Gellius also from 5.8.8. Now, the sound of the Lituus was acute, and differently from the grave and somber one of the tubas, witnessed by Ennius in the Annales 530, and Horace in the Carmina 1.1.23 and 2.1.18, and it was even considered shrill by Seneca, the Thyestes 575, and Lucanus in Pharsalia 1.237. And considering that it was a very simple instrument with an elevated acoustic intensity, it had to be used just as a signaling instrument. And However, the metallic Lituus seems to have disappeared starting from the 1st century BC. Therefore, it should have not been used in imperial times, as far as we understand, while the term remained in use, albeit only in the poetical texts, and I'd say also not in the most historically, reliable ones, as aulic, an elevated synonym of Tuba and Bucina. And we know a few also on the Lituus players. That's perhaps why we don't care about these things so much. He was called Litican, plural Liticines, and we do not have many representations of this instrument. We found just a few exemplars. One is came from a tomb at Cerveteri, and it's preserved in the Vatican museums. Another one has been found in Germany, and it's 78 centimeters long, and provided with a couple of rings along the body that let us think that let us imagine as it was carried, slung over the chest or the shoulder. And among the classical authors that mention it, such as Varro 516, Virgil in the Georgic has in 183, Servius in the Aeneid in 716, Priscianus in the Inscriptiones 482, 25. Some attributed to the use of cavalry units that had their own instruments, of course, and some scholars hypothesized that the Lituus could be not less than the famous classicum, both for the sound characteristics and for the etymology of the term that actually would derive from classis itself. So there are many stelae, for example, the one of the Cornican Copionus Felicio. We have that's from the Flavian period. It's a beautiful representation, or the one from the Cornican Victor, that displays the of the collegium of the Liticines and Cornicines from Sezze Romano from the 2nd century AD, preserved at the Sezze Museum. The one of Copionus Felicio is preserved at Mantua in the Ducal Palace. So, yeah, there is enough evidence for this stuff, and we have to think that these musical instruments were definitely part of a broader set of experiences that were all together with camp life, with religious life, with military life itself, as we've seen, that fundamentally we have lost because we can't just simply imagine what they could mean. The sounds of these instruments meant something to these people that went beyond the mere, okay, what do I have to do now in the field? It really defined the times and the spaces and the esprit de corps, the experiences of various units. These people lived by these sounds that were meant probably to replicate some, to transmit with their sound some meanings of the actual spirits and deities that intervened through the same in the life of man, right? So it wasn't a mere instrument. It was a voice. It was a being in itself, right? And this is what we often forget about the ancient world, where everything was an experience of this kind. It was true for every people. And we'll talk about these instruments also for other periods, right? And for now, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.